Thank you, everybody, for being here. And first of all, I just kind of want to get a sense of like the context in this room. I'm understanding that I'm from Colorado. I'm based in Colorado. I've been there over 10 years. Is everybody here, are you kind of long time? I don't know. Who's been in the New York area for the past 5 years, I guess? Okay. Less than 5 years? All right. Okay. That was what I was getting a sense of when I was talking to everybody. Okay. And this is really good for me. I mean, I'm just so excited to be in New York City. I haven't been here in years and it's just like I'm taking pictures. I'm like a tourist. And I really just love exploring other different types of environmental contexts. And I have to say that, so this is what we're going to do. I'm going to share some of my personal research stories about what I've learned throughout my career. We're going to think about collaborative research, impact, and application. And then I'm going to ask you to reflect on your experiences. I typically do not do a presentation where I just talk for 45 minutes, so it's going to be a bit of a challenge, but we wanted to make sure that we just recorded this. And that we'll have time after my presentation to have conversations. So I will ask you all to just kind of, what you can do if you want. I do have a lot of kind of questions in my presentation. So if you feel compelled, maybe just take a note and we're going to come back to the questions at the end. Part of the time, some of the questions were honestly for me because I was like, what am I doing? Where are we going? What are the questions that I'm kind of trying to address here? And I also just want to thank the Hudson River Foundation for having me here. And also Rupu was like, this was a collaborative effort. We met a couple times. We worked on my presentation. She helped kind of guide and coach and we threw out ideas. And so this is the result of that. I'm also just going to look at my phone sometimes just to check the time because sometimes I just get lost and I can't remember how long I've been speaking. It kind of feels like I've been doing it forever. All right. I just wanted to first ask yourselves, what's your intention? Like, what do you have here today for yourselves? And what would you like to maybe start with I don't know, your mindset? And I want to say that I was kind of nervous. So I was like, I'm gonna have fun and I'm gonna learn. And I think and I loved how the norms of engagement at the end was also have fun. Yes, let's have fun and let's learn from each other. And come at this with an open mind and maybe an inquisitive mind. So. All right, so what I'm going to do is I just kind of had this little landscape picture. I use a river because I used to work in Amazon, so I think about rivers. And so this is kind of, and I also just want to give you guys kind of a sense of where I'm coming from and my sort of perspective. I'll bring in elements of this. Don't worry, I'm not going to hopefully not tell you my life story, but I think the main piece here is like a lot of my foundational thinking comes from working with subsistence-based communities. I used to work with mostly kind of communities and forests, and certainly from a perspective of conservation and development. So a lot of stuff I talk about, I tend to think in this community kind of place-based community sort of sense. These days, though, and I went from that working in Thailand and Brazil to working on with observatories, large-scale observatories, resilience and earth science data, which is where I met Rupu. And then now today I work mostly with community science. So a lot of the stuff I just think about, I'm just always kind of thinking about communities. So bear with me if, hopefully that still applies to what we're talking about today. I started first with this question about research. So what is research? Why do we do it? What's it for? And how do we do it? So we're just going to come back to basics. And so the first thing I did is I started thinking about, as I was kind of thinking about my career trajectory, I thought about what was it that first inspired me to do research, just personally, like what was it? For me, when I was an undergrad, they introduced me to ethnobotany. And it was just like all these light bulbs went off. It was so fascinating for me. I wanted to learn about how people interact with their environment, how they perceive their environment, think about how they use it. And ethnobotany, once I learned about ethnobotany, it sort of broadened out to more like ethnoecology. I started thinking about like natural resource management. So it just kind of took me in all these different directions. And you can see there's a lot of different kind of lineages that people go on when they start thinking about people and our relationship to the environment. The other thing I really like to do is I would often travel independently. So I would just kind of go by myself and I would travel to different places around the world. And I would often just stay with people. Like I would just wanted to go and I would meet someone on the bus and be like, oh, invite me home for tea. And that was actually, later in retrospect, I thought about how important that was for my own practice and learning. One thing that Rupa said was how difficult it is to learn about working with people in like a classroom. It really takes a lot of just experience and personal experience. So getting out there and putting yourself in these positions, I felt like that really was very formative in the way I think about and the skill set I bring to working with communities. So my sort of first independent research experience, I had a Fulbright. I'm ethnically Thai, so I was really interested in going back to Thailand. And I went off into the northeast of Thailand, which is kind of like the elephants, the elephant head in this area. It's a very remote area. It's not the place where tourists go, but it's also very just culturally rich. And my mother's from there, so that was also important for me. While I was there, I was in the pharmaceutical science department at Khon Kaen University, and I ran across this book by Gary Martin called Ethnobotany and Methods Manual. There's this one chapter at the end called Ethnobotany, Conservation, and Community Development. And I have to say, that was the moment I realized how working and learning about the environment, how that goes hand in hand with community development. So if you are uplifting the well-being of people who are in forests or in their natural environment, that's one way to also work with conservation. So that's where that conservation development idea came from. So my first attempt, I tried working with a traditional healer in Northeast Thailand because they're herbalists. They tend to use, and not just herbalists, they use all parts of their environment for their medicinal purposes and their traditional medical system. And didn't go so well. Was my first try. I got like stonewalled. I think I met him a couple times, and then he was like, I'm not speaking to you anymore. Spent a lot of time reflecting, like, what went wrong? What did I do? The second time I had a friend. So I had a Thai friend who came with me. And I managed to find a community that would work with me. And I did a study on home gardens. I went around like interviewing people about like, what do you grow? Why do you grow? What do you have? Really opened up my mind in terms of what do people do with their environment? It's not just for medicine. It's not just for edibles. It's much more complex than that. So I finished that project barely, but I did it. I learned a lot. In the Khon Kaen library, I ran across this book this is the times when, we didn't have digital really, books. It's probably in 2003. So I ran across this book called The Ethnographic Interview by James Bradley. Have you guys who's read that book? No? Oh, I love this book. I read this book. I've read it so many times. What he talks about is the types of questions and your approaches to doing ethnography and the types of questions and inquiry that you have as you're speaking to people. I think the big lesson there is learning how to listen and to understand. You get into this position where you're really trying to just hear what people are saying and understand people's perspective and also their terminology. He goes through this book and he talks about like he worked with people who were in prisons and trying to understand the vernacular and the way they speak. And so I did my master's thesis with this ethnic minority group called the Gui. And I was studying about their traditional medicine system. So as you can imagine, very complex, not just plants, not just animals, just basically everything. They're very intertwined with their natural environment. And I did a lot of recording. So I went around interviewing people and just spending a lot of time with them. And so what did I accomplish? What time do we want to get the presentation to? Just double checking. 11? Okay. Okay, so what did I accomplish after 5 years in Thailand? I got really good at doing community-based field work. I felt really comfortable with the, living, with the learning, with the understanding. I learned about like a value proposition, for example. I don't know if I really framed it that way, but for example, like the failure I described, and then also the, some more successful research projects was, explaining your research to people so that they feel like, yes, I do want to speak to this person. The entry, so how it is that you enter into a community, who do you talk to first? How do you begin that conversation? The humility of being able to listen, learn, and also kind of put yourself in this learner's position and not coming in and being like, I know everything, because that, let me tell you, is not going to work. And being present. So being present is a very ethnography type of approach where I really believe when I do research, I want to base myself in the community where I am working. I also I learn the language. I make sure I'm speaking the language, even though I understand that there's a lot of different dialects and every single kind of region and community has their own language. And getting help. So I asked the people around me who were often like, they were Thai researchers to help me, other students, people who were there. Research is not something you can usually tackle on your own. And if you are trying to tackle it on your own, then, it depends on your question, but oftentimes when working with the community, you don't have enough perspective to be able to do that. So you need help from other folks. I got my master's degree, and importantly, I recorded information about this quickly disappearing way of life, knowledge system, and this ecosystem. So I did that. But then I also, at the end of this experience, I was really thinking about, these people who helped me. And honestly, that's what it was. Did they get anything out of it? What they really did is they helped me to do my research. What did they get out of it? And why did they do it? And is that something, how impactful was that? So we're going to revisit now, what is research? So the academic definition from the Health and Human Services, it's a systematic investigation, including research, development, testing, and evaluation designed to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge. This generalizable knowledge part is apparently very important. So, so what is research and what purpose does it serve? And if you think about it from, I tend to think in like scale. So like the individual to group level to society level, and then there's organizational level. Who cares? And what does it mean to all these different levels? So, for a researcher, for myself, for maybe my university, for my funders, why did I get funded? What's their interest? What's the interest of the government, of these businesses who are involved? For the people who are providing this information for me, what do they get out of it? And then what is society, who's often their tax dollars are paying for my research? What do they care and what do they get out of it? So we as researchers are kind of tasked with thinking about are all of what on all these different levels, what is it? What is it? Why does it matter? This is where I would normally ask for questions, but we're going to do questions at the end. All right. So, and feel free to just like, if you have thoughts, take a note, we'll get back to them. But so impact. So for whom, for what, how do we do it? How do we measure it? And what does it mean to you as a researcher? Because let's be honest here, it really is you as a researcher and the people you work with, you're determining what those impacts are. So as I moved on, I'm kind of moving on to my next phase of research. And when I was thinking, okay, what am I going to do next? I thought, okay, I'm going to do it different this time. I love this article. I had to go back and find it. It's by Campbell Plowden, who I've never met, and I really should reach out to him one day because I think about his article all the time. And he writes in this article, I was determined not to be another scientist who came into the community, gathered whatever data and materials he wanted, and left without giving much in return. And that was pretty much what I was thinking. I was like, that's going to be me. And I read this article later after I was almost done with my research. But the other thing that he talks about is he talks about how he did the study in the Amazon with an indigenous group there. And he went to these Gurupi villages and he went around trying to explain the goals of his research project. He's like, I'm going to do research that matters. And so he tried to explain what his research is. And then he finally said that he was studying. So he said the simplest explanation was I was studying plants that might lead to additional sources of income. But I believe most of the village accepted me as a friendly foreigner with quirky interests. Honestly, I could have written this. This is how my research went. And then he goes on towards the end of the article and he talks about all the different roles he took on as a researcher. And thinking about this kind of collaborative perspective of, you're working with the community in lots of different ways. He was a researcher, a medic, a teacher, an employer, a banker, a fundraiser, archivist. He was handicraft buyer. I mean, I did all these things. And then there were too many roles to keep up in the long haul. My inability to balance these roles led me to make mistakes that hurt my relationship with some members of the community. So this is where you're trying to balance between all these different scales and all the different players who you are all a part of this kind of complex system. And how are you going to navigate that? Like, this is not something you learn in school, right? This is really hard. So I went into Brazil, and I decided I was going to take on this systems approach. So I had this social ecological system. I consider myself a social ecologist. And this is an article I wrote. I have to say it's one of my most favorite articles. I read it recently and it like still stands up to the test of time. And I was going to find the right research project. So I knew that context was important. So I went to different places in Brazil, and I was exploring different research projects, and I was going to find the right question, the right project that was going to be impactful. I wanted to do research that mattered. And to me, that meant it was going to be non-exploitative and it was going to be helpful to the people that I worked with. So I ended up working in this region of Brazil. It's in the northern part of the northeast of Brazil. It's just on the edge of the Amazon, but it's pretty much, I mean, it's the ecology is very Amazon, but outside of the Amazonia proper region. It's at a place called Maranhão, Barreirinhas, Maranhão. So what I did is that I studied the participation of subsistence-based people in Buriti palm handicraft value chain. So how people are using this really important palm species. And they're using it to basically the global market is kind of encouraging them to be extracting these palm leaves and then selling them in the market. And there's a kind of a bigger question there of, there's an idea, an assumption that if we introduce markets to people who are considered poor, that it would change their livelihood, it would change their quality of life, their well-being, and it would kind of bring them into the global economy and everybody would be kind of uplifted out of poverty. So we all know that it's not working. Like, why is this not working? So that was basically the question I was looking at is why do people not participate in global markets? They're poor, they're in forests. So why don't they just kind of come on board? So with my systems perspective, what I did is I went around to these different kind of levels of potential people who would be interested in such a thing, which, I went around to policymakers. Luckily, Barreirinhas is a pretty small little town, so I could just like walk around and visit the ministries, environment, for example, people who are managing the resources. I went around to schools because I knew that schools were really important for people. They're often, seen as places of learning, but also kind of these community, resources. Nonprofits, any nonprofits that existed, there weren't many. There were kind of artisan groups, cooperatives. Those were kind of the grassroots groups. And there were a lot of individuals who helped me. There were people who I stayed with, people who assisted me, people who advised me. There were local leaders. So it was another thing that I did is that I made sure that I identified the informal kind of local leaders who are the people everybody looks up to and make sure those are the people I talk to and explain what I'm doing and get their buy-in. And then any other researchers that were there in the region and just helping. There actually weren't many, but there were some who had been there. So just helping, like making sure I know what they did and how I can build upon that. So what did I accomplish? I took those skills that I learned in Thailand and I wanted to transfer them into another context. So every time you're kind of shifting a context, does what I know that works in Southeast Asia, does that work in a place like Brazil where it's like the context and the culture and the language and the history is so different? And then I also broadened out my thinking. So in Thailand, I was very much focused on recording. So I'd learned, the like research, go record information, get it written down. That was research. Here, this was much more like, how does it matter on a much larger scale? And how do we think about research on this kind of systems, this sort of systems framing? I learned about setting the stage. So just making sure that I'm interacting with all these different people. I also did a lot of thinking about how I was benefiting the community. As Campbell Plowden was saying, like a lot of the work that what he did is it's direct benefits. So when you're working with individuals, it's often direct. So what can you give them? And then I was thinking about this kind of larger context of the social ecological system, transparency, living in the community. That was initially it was for being there, listening, understanding the culture. But at this point, it was also about being there and sharing, just like, here's what I'm doing. Do you see me? This is what I'm doing. Do you see me writing down notes? I'm taking notes. I'm a researcher. And then the cultural competence of, one thing I always tell people is that, you make sure you hire a cultural translator. So any community that I'm working in, it's not necessarily a language translator, but it's somebody who will help you understand the culture. Because when you face the nuances in the culture, even maybe the things they say, but they're not saying, it's very difficult to understand that when you're there. So having somebody who will be in your ear and be like, when you're like, what does that person want? She keeps like, I had this experience where this woman would come and like stand and watch me eat. And she would come every day and I'd be like, do you want something to eat? And finally I asked my my cultural translator. I was like, what does she want? And he says, what do you think she wants? So I offered her a job. So, so sometimes it's like that you can't really figure out the nuances and you don't want to offend people. So that's what a cultural, and I would suggest that even if you're in the US working in a context that it has always been one of the best learning, one of the best things that I do working with communities. And then also the closing. I felt like I could have done the closing better. In Thailand, I sort of I did give, kind of like provide like, I don't know, I gave gifts to the people I stayed with. I gave gifts to the schools, but I felt like my closing was sort of like, I didn't quite end it properly. So that was one thing I did different here too. And so I went around to all these different groups that I listed initially, and I made sure I thought about what is the specific benefit I'm going to offer. Like maybe there's kind of these broader, impactful things you kind of hope for. It's what you write in your NSF broader impacts. Like, here's what I will do. But then it's like when you're really in the community level, you think about like, what is it these people are getting out of it? So for example, I had my research, I translated it into Portuguese. I had it written up into a report. I gave those to like the ministries. I gave some to the libraries, put them in the libraries. I made posters that explained like what is Burichi? Where does it come from? That was really helpful for the people who like in the markets who were selling things, or in the stores. They wanted to have a little thing they could point to and say, oh, look at these beautiful pictures. I had field assistants and my cultural translators. They were lovely. I also figured out that younger people were the best people to work with because they're not like busy. So they'd come and boat me around and help me figure out what's going on. They were wonderful. And they also were real assistants. Like I really like worked with them to like how to do research. Luis Carlos here, he was wonderful. He was like, he helped. I gave him my camera. He went around, took pictures of people in ways that I would have maybe not felt comfortable doing. Be like, hey, he knew everybody. So take pictures of people. He took notes. Well, he didn't write very well, but he would, he would have the papers. He would like learn how the interview, template went. He was definitely like my best buddy on the field. And then the other thing we did is we gave photos to people. I learned this in Thailand. We took pictures of people, we printed them out, and sometimes it was the only photo they had. So they really loved the photo. So we'd come back, we'd always have photos. But then, many years later, so you can see this is from 2023. So I finished that research in 2007. I got an email, a cold call, basically from a woman. And she said, I'm a local researcher in this very under-resourced small university, federal university in Brazil. And she said, I have read all your papers and I'm working in the same region. And can you help me? And she was trying to publish her work and could not get them published. So I started, and the other thing she said to me too, which was very convincing, is she said, while she was doing her research, she said, I was so afraid as a woman to go out into the field and be interviewing these people, especially in this little town called Barreirinhas. And she said, but I would think about you as a foreigner and thinking about you doing this. I felt like I could do this. And I was like, I will help you. So I helped her get her research published, and she really did it. Like she got rejected. We'd keep working on it, and we did it all over WhatsApp. And they had terrible internet. So we got these two papers published, and I was so proud of these two papers that Irlene did. So what is impact? So impact, I pulled them off the internet. Tangible, real world change, long-term, broader change in people's lives. For me, it's, did it make any, did it result in any sort of change in anybody's lives? And on what scale? So, those different scales of individuals, communities, government, society. Who cares? There's the NSF broader impact. I recently did an NSF review panel. So we were really thinking about this. The people involved, it's usually you're thinking about direct benefits. The people who want to build on your work, that's like researchers like Irlene, who's coming after you? Is your work valuable enough or useful enough that somebody, and it's written up in a way and shared in a way that somebody can actually use it? And then the community and towns that you're working with. And then how do we know? So that's the impact piece of, what are we trying to measure? I shared a little example here, and I'm aware of the time. Thank you, Rupu. This was a work and kind of similar, when I graduated I finished my PhD, I was actually really surprised. I was from the University of Florida. We did a lot of very community-based types of stuff. I was actually really surprised to leave and graduate and figure out that there was not a very good social science perspective on the way we use the environment. And I learned this through the WCS, World Wildlife Conservation Society. They hired me to go out there and work with these protected area managers to do a training around how to collect socioeconomic data in communities. And I was like, why me? Like, why don't you find one of these really great Brazilian researchers? Because they're really good. And they were like, we couldn't find anybody. So, and then I started learning this as I started interacting with other nonprofits. I remember TNC, or maybe I think it was the Nature Conservancy, had told me as well, oh, we're starting a social science project. We don't have anybody. And I was like, how can you be like working with the environment and protecting the environment and not understand how people are using it and not have really good tools and methods to do that? So early stages, it's been, I don't know, 10 years, and still I feel like I think that doesn't seem like a long time. All right, and the other thing I want to share too is whose values. So this is a paper we did on fire resilience. And, it's a workshop like this. We came together and we talked a lot, and we published, thankfully to the PI of this project, he pushed through a couple of papers. But this one, I have to say, a lot of my learning comes through writing papers. If you guys don't write, it is one of the best ways to learn about something. You really explore. Even putting this presentation together, I learned a lot. And we, through this paper together, it's about 15 people, I think, or more on this article, and we really thought about the values. And so when you're thinking about fire resilience, you're wondering, is this okay? Who gets protected? How much protection do we want to do? And it really depends on these different values. Like, is that okay? Is that enough? Oh, well, is that okay for these people? But you forget about that other group. So I really learned about the importance of values and people's values and perspectives while doing this work. This was before the big fires. So after this, there was like some really big fires. I'm in Colorado. We think about fires all the time. It was featured in the New York Times where they cited this. We were basically saying that maybe there's some place in the world maybe we can't live in every forest and everywhere we want to. Maybe we need to move out. And that's apparently mind-blowing for humans. They're like, what do you mean we can't do everything we want? So what does impact mean in your context? And how do you know you've been impactful? And how can we increase our impact if we want to? I'm going to assume here that everybody wants to. All right, here's where I worked in Brazil. It was beautiful. This is the Lençóis Maranhenses. Collaborative research. So what does it mean? Why do we do it? And how do we do it? So I pulled this off also from the National Estuarine Research Reserve System Science Collaborative, that it's a co-creation process that involves scientists, managers, communities, and others. But you know what? When I was thought about this, it also, I feel like collaborative research, sometimes it's framed in a way that feels a little bit unattainable. Like, can we really manage that? So what does it mean to collaborate to us, and especially in your context? And why do we do it? So why do we collaborate? We collaborate because as a human and a person, as an individual, it's often very difficult, and I might say impossible, to understand systems, like complex systems from different perspectives. I put an example of the water cycle, but I also put an example of Boulder, Colorado. And I love thinking about cities and towns as a complex social ecological system. And the way I usually will show that is that, you look at all the different departments. You got a water department, we have an open space mountain parks, you've got transportation, you've got housing, you've got all economics, you've got all these different departments. They're a little bit siloed. And they're very siloed, honestly. And then they're trying to also form this bigger picture of this social ecological system. So, and where it's people trying to live in this world. And it's also very difficult to predict what might happen. So to me, that's a really characteristic of a complex system. Here's a bunch of different framings of collaboration. I know I'm probably running out of time, but and I think what's here is, sometimes, as I mentioned, that we're often trying to be like, we've got to co-create, we've got to work together, we've got to be collaborative. That's kind of the transdisciplinary piece of the practice merges with research, but there's a lot of other ways to do it. And you don't have to do this. It depends on what you're working on. If you're working on a small picture question, maybe you don't need to be involving other people. But this is a really nice depiction of how people can work together, but very theoretical, right? Not in practice. This is an article. I'm going to just share the article with you. One thing that Rupu asked, she said, oh, why don't you share some of your success stories? And I was like, I don't know if I've been really that successful. And even in this article, I ran across this article after that, and they don't quite get to the end. They just say, here's these groups, tribal leaders, and they're working with these climate government people, and then they come together and we successfully created a plan. So did they, how's the plan going? I don't know, but I would want to take a look at it and see what you think. Here's a little example of a different type of collaboration. So, I guess up here, I wanted to try to describe that there's lots of different ways to collaborate. And, collaborate in the best sense is that you bring together all these different players. You come together at the beginning, you form your research question together, and then you begin to embark together on this research project. Like that's a very, very specific context. And quite frankly, very, very difficult to have the type of context where that works. This one, what we did is C4, if you've ever heard of them, they're based in Indonesia. For anyone working with community forestry, like that's the place you want to work. So I worked as a contractor for them. And what they did is they pulled together, they wanted to do a study on Southeast Asian smallholders on sloping landscapes, basically on mountains. And they pulled us all together in a workshop. There were each person representing a different country. We came together, we decided together on what those research questions were, and we went out and did it. And they wanted to kind of pick up on those scales. So I interviewed the military, I interviewed these policymakers, researchers, farmers, and then we came together and put it all together in a report. And that was going to inform policymaking and funding, quite frankly, of how they would fund these smallholders. So I think we're going to get to this question later on today, but just think about what type of collaborative research experiences have you had? And you can maybe think about it on the scale of like, collaboration. We collaborated on a paper together. We worked together as colleagues. To all the way to when did you ever really work? Did you work with decision makers? Did you work with other people outside of your field? And, kind of think about it on a spectrum. So application. So here's kind of the third phase in my inquiry into collaborative community-based research. How does it look in practice? What does it look like for me? This is my personal journey. So what it looks like for all of you, it's always different. So I have this framework I call community activation. And this is where I have taken everything that I know about communities, what I think works, doesn't work, and I've brought it into a different space. So this is kind of the global distributed space and working with organizations. And with a community, here's how I define community: a large group of people that collaborates together for a common purpose. Like we, could potentially be a community if we start kind of working together and we are collaborating. We could be a community. We have a common purpose here. The other piece here is this participation types in communities. This comes from Arnstein's ladder of citizen participation that probably some of you here are familiar with. I pulled this out, simplified it in terms of how an organization or an organization working with a community or maybe has their own community. Like when you think of like joining a community, like say the American Evaluation Association, you join an association, you join a professional society, you become a community. How do you expect people to volunteer? Maybe you're working in a park. So how do you get volunteers to engage? Do volunteers start making decisions? How do they maybe get into leadership roles? Those types of questions with an organization. And I have this community activation framework that I use when I'm talking to organizations, which involves outreach, engagement, community building, and then that kind of pinnacle. It's the community mobilization. That's when you almost get to this kind of this activism type of where everyone's like able to make decisions, kind of like a gardening co-op or something like that, or maybe a community garden. Like we're all making decisions. How much water are we going to use? Where should we store the tools? And everyone's involved in that decision making. So the Ronan Institute, I was the community director there for a few years, and it was a wonderful place to be because we were really experimental. And what I got to do is I took all of those learnings from working with place-based communities and we transcended place. So we started working in this digital space. So then it becomes really interesting because you're not going into a community, but you're creating a community. So then how do you do that? The two kind of lessons learned there is, what was wonderful is it was all kind of really smart people. These are all people with PhDs who are academics who don't want to be in the university setting, but we all wanted to create this institute. So, part of that was developing the environment, the digital environment, developing those structures and the systems, the workflows, the transparency of like, how do we do things? And then how do you kind of help empower people to be able to be a part of creating this thing. So there's that co-creation. And now today I work in Middle Path Eco Solutions and I kind of take this framing and I bring it to organizations and we think about like, how much community do you want involved? What does community mean to you? How do you engage people? And how much should those people who you're working with be a part of your decision making? Now, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, sometimes it's not a good fit. So is it research? So then I finished this and then I was like done and then I was traveling here. I was like, but wait a second, I missed a really key part. Is it research? I think about it as scholarship. To me, scholarship is a lot broader. Scholarship to me is kind of this more like, I don't know, general inquiry, but something I'll have to think about. But you know, to me, it was also this crowdsourced collaborative approach of discovery and inquiry. So together we're in a community and we're all working together to learn how to be a community and meet our goals. Like at the Ronan Institute, we talked about like, how do we do scholarship independently outside of a mortar and brick institute? We all did it together and we thought about it. We helped each other. We created working groups and, you know, and that to me was kind of this, like, that's this kind of creation of a co-creation of a new kind of way of working. And then all these aspects that I shared of collaborative research, like the entry, the value proposition, the listening, the humility, the social ecological systems approach of this kind of complexity. How do we do that? And so I brought all of those together. And I had to share, I couldn't get into the how do you measure impacts piece. So I put a whole bunch of stuff here that, you know, when I think about measuring, collecting data from communities, is it working? Is this community working? Are we achieving our goals? I love the emergent framing, emergent learning and frameworks. I just shared that here. It's really short-term cycles of evaluation. And I think the point there is that, you know, is that we're learning organizations. Our communities are learning. So how do you implement this in a way that helps support our learning as a community, which I think is basically what we're doing here. We're all learning. None of us was in the high collaboration space because we're all learning together. And so how can we support our learning, capture that learning, share that learning, and kind of build on all of these practices that we know work? So I learned to be flexible with research. So how do you apply and think about collaborative research in a broad spectrum? So from place-based all the way to the digital global environment, when you start going across cultures, it starts to get really complicated. And then also on an organizational level. So instead of working at the individual level, I now think about it I'm more kind of in this organizational space. And part of that is, you know, I'm always thinking about the metrics, the measurement. What are the metrics? What does it mean to be a community? What does it mean to be a really functional community? To be supportive, to be in the support role where I'm helping other organizations or other grassroots, maybe the communities, kind of uplift them and help them meet the goals that they want to meet and not necessarily the goals that I want people to meet, which is kind of how I started my research journey. Developing these systems. So usually what I'm doing is I'm kind of social engineering. I call it social engineering. I'm social engineering these structures that people can work within. And this transparency, documentation, I'm a big documentation person. So like document everything. How do things work? Who are the rules? The informal, like usually rules, if you don't write the rules down, they're being formed informally. So then there's what usually happens in communities, you start to kind of create these informal sort of, you know, insider groups. So part of that is this transparency of how are decisions made? How do you make decisions? And sometimes that's often when I'm working with groups, it's like one of the first things we do. We just like write it down. Like, what do you guys do? How do you make decisions? How does one become a decision maker? And then being inclusive. So what does that really mean? You know, sometimes we think, oh, we're inclusive. We're inviting people here. We've got a community. We're sending out newsletters, you know, but does inclusivity, can it mean that people and lots of different people, how much of a voice do they have and how much of a say do they have in decision making? And, you know, those are actually really, really hard questions that sometimes what I've encountered this, organizations think they're being inclusive when they really get to it of now it's time to invite the community in, they can't do it. So not as easy as we think it is. So this is a question to you guys, and this is the end. How do you apply what you know about collaborative research? And everyone's on their own journey. And how do you apply it to your own work and your goals? This is my moment to remind myself to pause. This is Boulder. It's great hiking, by the way, and skiing. So what's your learning journey? When I was a grad student, we wrote this paper as grad students and knowledge exchange with local stakeholders. And we thought about, as a student, and we're working with these communities, how is it that we are exchanging knowledge and able to like build our skills that we need to be researchers? As I was searching for that and looking at citations, I was trying to actually find this paper that didn't end up being a good fit for this lecture, but I came across this article. It just came out in 2025. Might be something you want to explore. It's about the essential skills for training of conservation social scientists. So it sounds very relevant to here. But all the papers I read about kind of skill building in this space, they all talk about these soft skills. So these skills that I basically talked about that you have to just learn by doing and make a lot of mistakes, which unfortunately can also be very harmful to communities. You know, I've read research proposals where they say, I'm going to go off and work in this indigenous tribe, and I've never done it before. I'm just like, no, that's like high level participatory work. It's like, so you can be very harmful in communities. And especially, I think we talked about, there's a paper Rupu shared with me about why am I always being researched? I had a story about that too, but I didn't have time for it. But you can exhaust people. They don't want to do it anymore. They're like, why? Like, you guys can't get it straight. Like, why do I have to keep doing this? So I pulled together all my bullet points of my learnings, put it together on a slide, also partly for me. So I was like, okay, what have I got here? Put there for you guys. I think you can have access to this slide deck. And then I pulled together all my questions. And you know what, to be honest, I still have these questions. So, so I'm sharing those with you. And maybe as you go along in your journey, you can think about your questions and your answers, and maybe that'll change as you move along. And I think that's the end. This is basically what I do. These are some of the groups I'm working with currently. Recently. And I have a new book. This book just came out earlier in February. And please connect with me on LinkedIn. That's how I kind of keep track of people that I meet. And I'd love to engage there. But our book here has a really great intro the intro is all about like, are you a community steward? And you'll be surprised. You probably are, because we wear all these different hats. And it's also kind of this workbook that you can go through of learning these different skills of working with communities and engaging and stewarding communities. And there's a list of some of the publications that I had in the presentation, just summarize it all. And that's it. Thank you guys for listening. Thank you.